Princess Charlotte, the beloved granddaughter of King Charles III, had always been a spirited and inquisitive young girl. Despite her royal status, her parents, Prince William and Princess Kate, had instilled in her a deep sense of humility. She was no stranger to public outings, often mingling with ordinary people, enjoying the world outside the grandeur of the palace walls. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. One crisp autumn afternoon, Charlotte, dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue dress, slipped away from her usual royal engagements with her nanny. She had a craving for something different, something exciting. Her curiosity led her to a quaint restaurant in London, a place that had been gaining popularity for its exquisite menu and intimate ambiance. The scent of freshly baked bread and roasted meats wafted from its doors, luring her in with a promise of a delicious meal. Excited, Charlotte pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The restaurant was bustling with life, filled with patrons chatting over plates of exquisite delicacies. A warm glow from the candle-lit tables gave the place a cozy yet sophisticated feel. She approached the hostess, a tall, impeccably dressed woman with a stern face. "Good afternoon," Charlotte said politely. "May I have a table, please?" The hostess, who had been glancing at the reservations list, barely spared her a glance. She took in the girl's simple yet tasteful dress and frowned. To her, Charlotte looked like an ordinary child, perhaps even one who had wandered in from the cold in search of food. "I'm sorry, young lady," she said with a tight-lipped smile. "This is an exclusive establishment. We do not accommodate walk-ins, especially not children without a guardian." Charlotte blinked in surprise. She was unused to being dismissed so curtly. "I can pay," she assured the woman. "I have money." The hostess barely concealed her irritation. "It's not about money, dear. This is a fine dining restaurant. We have a dress code and a strict policy regarding unaccompanied minors. I'm afraid you'll have to leave." A few customers nearby had started whispering, their eyes flicking toward Charlotte with curiosity. Still, no one intervened. Charlotte, feeling a flush of embarrassment rise to her cheeks, hesitated. "But I just wanted something to eat," she said, her voice quieter now. A waiter, overhearing the exchange, stepped forward. He had been working at the restaurant for years and had developed a keen sense of identifying high-profile guests. He recognized Charlotte almost immediately, the unmistakable golden brown hair, the refined way she held herself despite her young age. His eyes widened in shock. "Madam!" he whispered urgently to the hostess, leaning in. "I believe this is Princess Charlotte." The hostess let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "And I'm the Queen of England. Stop being ridiculous." But the waiter was now visibly nervous. He knew that turning away a member of the royal family, especially one as beloved as Princess Charlotte, could spell disaster. "Perhaps we should confirm first?" he suggested hesitantly. "Nonsense," the hostess snapped. "Even if she were a princess, we have rules here. If she wants to dine with us, she should make a reservation like everyone else." With that, she turned back to Charlotte. "I'm afraid I must insist," she said. "Please leave. We have no room for unaccompanied children here." Hurt and humiliated, Charlotte clenched her small fists. She had never used her title to demand special treatment, but she had never been dismissed so harshly either. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her head held high despite the sting of rejection. The restaurant resumed its usual chatter, and the hostess seemed pleased with herself for maintaining the exclusivity of the establishment. The waiter, however, had a sinking feeling in his gut. He knew this was a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake. 30 minutes later, the street outside the restaurant erupted into a commotion. A fleet of sleek black cars pulled up along the curb, the unmistakable emblem of the royal household gleaming in the afternoon light. The back door of one vehicle opened and out stepped King Charles III himself, his face unreadable. The restaurant staff froze. The hostess paled instantly, her heart hammering in her chest. Customers turned their heads in stunned silence as the king, accompanied by 2 royal guards, strode toward the restaurant's entrance. The doors swung open with a dramatic creak and King Charles walked inside, his eyes scanning the room. The restaurant, once lively and filled with chatter, now sat in eerie silence. The hostess, suddenly finding her voice, hurriedly stepped forward. "Your Majesty," she stammered, forcing a smile. "What an unexpected honor!" King Charles raised a hand, silencing her immediately. I was informed that my granddaughter was turned away from this establishment, he said, his voice calm yet commanding. Is that true? The hostess felt the weight of every single pair of eyes in the room pressing down on her. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation, a justification, anything. There must have been some misunderstanding, she began, but the king's sharp gaze stopped her. Did you or did you not refuse service to Princess Charlotte? There was no point in lying. The truth was already out. The hostess swallowed hard. Yes, Your Majesty, but we have strict policies. King Charles inhaled deeply, his disappointment evident. Policies, he repeated, his tone filled with quiet disdain. Policies that led you to turn away a young girl seeking nothing more than a meal? A girl who, might I remind you, carries herself with more dignity than those who claim to run this establishment? The hostess opened her mouth, but no words came out. Do you know what the essence of hospitality is? The king continued, his voice steady. It is kindness. It is inclusivity. It is making people feel welcome no matter their status. You have failed in every regard. By now, whispers filled the restaurant as customers watched the scene unfold. Some, realizing who the little girl had been, were visibly ashamed for not stepping in. King Charles turned to the manager, who had arrived looking flustered and terrified. Effective immediately, this restaurant is to be removed from any list of establishments that receive royal patronage, he declared. No member of the royal family will dine here again, and I will ensure that this incident is well known across the country. The hostess felt her knees go weak. The consequences of this were immeasurable. The restaurant thrived on prestige. Losing royal patronage meant losing the very clientele that kept them afloat. The manager stammered out an apology, but it was far too late. King Charles then looked toward the waiter, the only one who had recognized Charlotte for who she was. You, he said. You showed concern. You tried to intervene. What is your name? The waiter, trembling slightly, gave his name. Come to the palace tomorrow, the king instructed. I believe we may have a place for someone of your sensibility in our service. The young man's eyes widened in disbelief. Thank you, Your Majesty, he said, bowing deeply. King Charles turned on his heel and left the restaurant, his presence lingering like an unspoken reprimand. Outside, Charlotte, who had been waiting in the car, peeked through the window. When she saw her grandfather approach, she smiled. Did you fix it, Grandpapa? She asked innocently. King Charles chuckled, opening the door and stepping inside. I believe they have learned their lesson, he said. Now, let's find you a meal, shall we? And with that, the royal convoy pulled away, leaving behind a restaurant drowning in regret. The weight of what had just transpired in the restaurant lingered in the air like the aftermath of a storm. The hostess, once confident and unwavering in her rigid policies, now stood motionless, her face drained of all color. The restaurant's patrons remained silent, processing the dramatic turn of events. Some whispered among themselves, recounting every detail of what had just occurred, while others merely stared at the exit through which King Charles had just departed. The manager, who had arrived moments too late to salvage the situation, ran a hand through his thinning hair, sweat beading at his temple. He knew this was not just an incident that would be forgotten overnight. No, the consequences of this mistake would ripple far beyond the walls of their establishment. The royal family was the heartbeat of the United Kingdom, and to slight them, especially in such an egregious manner, was tantamount to social and professional suicide. The young waiter, who had been the only one to recognize Charlotte, stood stunned. His chest swelled with a mix of emotions. Relief that he had not participated in the mistreatment, but also shock that he had been offered an opportunity to work within the royal household. His mind spun at the possibilities. He had always dreamed of working in the presence of royalty, but never had he imagined his chance would come in such a manner. Meanwhile, back inside the royal convoy, Princess Charlotte sat comfortably in the plush leather seats, her small hands resting on her lap as she glanced at her grandfather with a knowing look. You were very firm with them, Grandpapa, she said, her voice laced with amusement. King Charles sighed, his stern expression softening slightly. Respect is earned, Charlotte, and those who deny kindness to others often find themselves left out in the cold when they need it the most. I have no doubt that restaurant will suffer greatly from its own arrogance. Charlotte tilted her head, deep in thought. Do you think they'll change? That they'll be nicer to people after this? The king chuckled, patting her hand affectionately. One can only hope. But people seldom change unless they feel the weight of their mistakes. And I think they're feeling it quite profoundly at this very moment. As the royal motorcade weaved through the busy streets of London, the news of the incident had already begun to spread. Unbeknownst to the restaurant, a few patrons had discreetly recorded parts of the exchange between King Charles and the hostess. Within minutes, the footage found its way to social media. The video, accompanied by captions such as "Royal Snub, Restaurant Rejects Princess Charlotte, Regret Ensues," began going viral at an alarming speed. By the time the restaurant staff had managed to compose themselves and attempt damage control, the internet had already sealed their fate. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook were flooded with comments of outrage and disbelief. News articles surfaced within the hour, dissecting the event from every possible angle. High-end London eatery rejects royalty, loses favor with King Charles, restaurant kicks out Princess Charlotte, faces public backlash, royal snub, how one restaurant's mistake could cost them everything. Within mere hours, the restaurant's phone lines were flooded with calls, most of them angry. Some demanded an explanation, others went as far as to cancel their reservations, and still others took to online review platforms giving scathing one-star reviews. Absolutely appalled by the way this establishment treated Princess Charlotte. If they could treat a child with such coldness, imagine how they treat regular people. This restaurant had the audacity to turn away royalty? The arrogance is unbearable. I'll be taking my business elsewhere. Disgraceful. I hope they close down. The restaurant, once an elite and sought-after dining destination, found itself sinking into disrepute at an alarming speed. By the time the owners, who had been away on holiday, heard of the debacle, the damage had already been done. Frantic, they convened an emergency meeting, summoning their PR team and legal advisors in a desperate attempt to salvage their name. "We need a public apology," the head of PR stated bluntly, placing both hands on the long oak table. "And we need it now." The owner, an aging yet formidable businessman, rubbed his temples. "How bad is it exactly?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. One of the managers pulled up the analytics on a tablet. "Our online ratings have plummeted overnight. We've lost over 300 reservations in the past 4 hours, and social media is demanding an apology, some even calling for a boycott." The room fell silent. They had built this restaurant from the ground up, earning a reputation for excellence, exclusivity, and high standards. Never in their wildest dreams had they thought that their own arrogance would lead to their downfall. The PR team quickly drafted a statement. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred at our establishment earlier today involving Her Royal Highness Princess Charlotte. Our policies are designed to ensure a pleasant dining experience for all guests, but we recognize that in this instance, we acted in a manner that was neither welcoming nor fitting of our values. We sincerely apologize to the royal family and to the public for this regrettable mistake. Steps will be taken to ensure that such an incident never happens again." The statement was released on all platforms, but it was too little, too late. The damage had been done. Meanwhile, across the city, Charlotte and King Charles had found themselves in a small, family-run restaurant tucked away in a quieter part of London. The aroma of home-cooked meals filled the air, and the warmth of the establishment immediately put Charlotte at ease. The owner, an elderly woman with kind eyes, approached their table, unaware at first of who she was serving. "What can I get for you, dears?" she asked with a smile. Charlotte grinned. "I'll have whatever you recommend." The woman chuckled. "That's a dangerous request, young lady. My food will have you coming back for more." As she turned to take their order to the kitchen, another waiter approached, recognizing the king at last. His eyes widened, and he nearly dropped his notepad. Your Majesty," he stammered, bowing deeply, "it's an honor to have you here." King Charles smiled warmly. "It is our honor to be here." The waiter, overwhelmed with gratitude, quickly whispered to the owner, who returned to the table with fresh enthusiasm. "We are truly honored," she said, clasping her hands together. "Please, your meal is on the house." Charlotte's eyes sparkled. "Really? That's so kind of you," the woman laughed. "Kindness should always be free, child. The world needs more of it." King Charles nodded approvingly. "That is a sentiment I wholeheartedly agree with. As they enjoyed their meal, the contrast between the two restaurants became painfully clear. The first had been exclusive, cold, and unwelcoming. This one, though small and unassuming, was filled with warmth, generosity, and the true spirit of hospitality. By the next morning, the headlines had shifted once more. Now the focus was on how a small family restaurant had unknowingly won the favor of the king. Royalty chooses humble eatery over high-end snobbery. King Charles and Princess Charlotte find comfort in London's hidden gem. A tale of two restaurants, the power of kindness over prestige. The humble restaurant saw an influx of new customers, all eager to experience the warmth that had won over the royal family. The owner, overwhelmed by the attention, remained as gracious as ever, simply stating, "We treated them like family, as we do with all our guests." Meanwhile, the high-end restaurant that had snubbed Charlotte struggled to recover. Despite their apology, their reputation had been irrevocably tarnished. Within months, their revenue plummeted, and eventually the once prestigious eatery was forced to shut its doors permanently. In contrast, the small family-run restaurant continued to flourish, proving that true hospitality was not about exclusivity or prestige, but about warmth, generosity, and the simple act of making people feel welcome. As Charlotte sat in Buckingham Palace weeks later, flipping through newspaper articles covering the event, she turned to her grandfather with a thoughtful expression. "You were right, Grandpapa," she said. "People don't change unless they feel the weight of their mistakes." King Charles smiled. "Indeed, my dear. And sometimes the greatest lessons come from the simplest of moments." And with that, Princess Charlotte tucked away the memory of the event, knowing that she had learned something far more valuable than any grand feast could ever offer. The weeks following the incident at the high-end restaurant saw a ripple effect that no one could have foreseen. What had initially been an isolated act of arrogance had now become a cautionary tale in the hospitality industry. Restaurant owners, managers, and staff across London and beyond began reevaluating how they treated their guests. The fallout from dismissing Princess Charlotte had been so severe that many establishments realized they could not afford to let their own exclusivity turn into snobbery. Public discourse swirled around the incident, evolving from simple outrage to a broader discussion about class, entitlement, and the very meaning of hospitality. News programs invited experts on etiquette, customer service, and even members of the Royal Watch to weigh in on what the restaurant could have done differently. "The most striking part of the incident," one commentator remarked during a morning television segment, "was not just that they turned away a member of the royal family, but that they did so in such a dismissive and condescending manner. It speaks to a deeper issue within certain high-end establishments that prioritize prestige over genuine service." Social media was abuzz with debates. Some argued that restaurants had a right to enforce their policies without exception, while others insisted that any business that turned away a child, royalty or not, had fundamentally failed at the essence of hospitality. Even celebrities and well-known figures chimed in. A famous Michelin-starred chef tweeted, "A restaurant isn't just about the food, it's about the experience. If you turn away a child who just wants a meal, you've missed the point entirely." Another high-profile restaurant owner gave an interview in which he stated, "If King Charles himself walked into my restaurant with his granddaughter, I wouldn't just serve them, I'd personally cook for them. That's the respect and honor you give to guests, regardless of status." Meanwhile, the royal household made no further official statements regarding the incident. King Charles had said all that needed to be said in person, and he had made it clear where the family's values lay by choosing to support the humble eatery that had welcomed them. However, within the walls of Buckingham Palace, the impact of the incident was still being felt, particularly by Princess Charlotte. Though she had always been well aware of the privileges that came with her title, this experience had given her a new perspective. She had never thought of herself as different from other children her age, but the treatment she had received at the first restaurant had shown her the stark reality of how people's judgments could be shaped by appearances and assumptions. One afternoon, as she sat in the palace gardens sketching a few flowers in her notebook, she turned to her mother, Princess Kate, with a thoughtful expression. "Mummy," she said, tapping her pencil against the page, "do you think people treat me differently because I'm a princess?" Kate smiled gently, setting aside her book to look at her daughter. "Well, my darling, people may treat you differently, but what truly matters is how you treat them. You can't control how others see you, but you can always choose to be kind." Charlotte nodded, digesting this advice. The lady at the restaurant didn't even ask who I was before she sent me away, she murmured. She just assumed I wasn't important enough to be there. Kate reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Charlotte's ear. That's often the way of the world, sweetheart. Some people judge others based on what they think they see, rather than who they truly are. Charlotte frowned. But that's not fair. No, it isn't, Kate agreed. Which is why it's so important that we lead by example. You showed grace when you walked away from that restaurant, and your grandfather showed wisdom in how he handled the situation. Charlotte thought about this for a moment. I want to make sure people are treated better, she said firmly. Not just me, but everyone. Kate beamed with pride. That's a wonderful thought, Charlotte, and you have the power to make a difference. That evening, inspired by her conversation with her mother, Charlotte took out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing a letter. Dear Grandpapa, I have been thinking a lot about what happened at the restaurant. I know that people should not be judged by how they look or whether they have a title. I think we should do something to help others who are not treated fairly. Maybe there is a way to encourage restaurants to be more welcoming, especially to children and families who don't always feel like they belong in certain places. I would love to talk to you about this more. Love, Charlotte. When King Charles received his granddaughter's letter the next morning, he felt a swell of pride. He had always known Charlotte to be thoughtful and kind, but this was something more. It was the sign of a young leader beginning to understand the power of influence and responsibility. Later that week, he invited Charlotte to his study for tea. I received your letter, he said, pouring her a small cup of chamomile tea, and I must say it was very well thought out. Charlotte sipped her tea carefully. I just don't want other people to feel like I did that day, she said earnestly. Even if I weren't a princess, I should have been treated kindly. The king nodded. I agree, which is why I have an idea. How would you like to help me establish an initiative that encourages restaurants, cafes, and other establishments to be more inclusive and welcoming? Charlotte's eyes widened. Really? How would we do that? Well, Charles said, setting down his teacup, we could start by working with charities that support families who don't always have access to nice places to eat. We could also create a recognition program, a sort of royal seal of approval for restaurants that show outstanding hospitality, kindness, and inclusivity. Charlotte beamed. That sounds wonderful. And maybe we could visit some of these places and see for ourselves how they treat people. King Charles smiled warmly. Exactly. This could be your very first royal project, Charlotte, something you can truly call your own. And so, what had begun as a moment of humiliation and rejection was transformed into something far greater. Under the guidance of King Charles, Princess Charlotte spearheaded an initiative called the Open Arms Initiative, which encouraged hospitality establishments to embrace inclusivity and kindness as core values. The program partnered with renowned chefs, restaurant associations, and charities to create dining experiences for underprivileged families. Those establishments that demonstrated exceptional warmth and fairness received a special royal endorsement, a discreet emblem on their doors that signified their commitment to true hospitality. The impact was swift and remarkable. Restaurants across the country began striving for the recognition, understanding that real prestige lay not in exclusivity, but in their ability to welcome guests from all walks of life. Months later, as Charlotte and her family attended an event celebrating the success of the initiative, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that fateful day at the restaurant. What had once been a moment of personal hurt had turned into something that had made a real difference in people's lives. Standing beside her grandfather, Charlotte smiled as she watched a young boy and his mother enjoy a meal in one of the participating restaurants, their faces alight with happiness. I think this is what you meant by leading by example, she said softly. King Charles placed a hand on her shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. Indeed, my dear, and I have no doubt that this is just the beginning for you. And so Princess Charlotte, once turned away from a restaurant, had not only risen above the moment, but had used it to change the industry for the better. The restaurant that had rejected her was now nothing more than a memory, while the values she had championed would endure for generations to come. The Open Arms Initiative grew beyond what anyone had initially imagined. What had started as a small response to an unfortunate incident soon evolved into a national conversation about accessibility, fairness, and the role of hospitality in fostering a sense of belonging. The initiative quickly expanded to include not just high-end restaurants, but also cafes, bakeries, hotels, and even public spaces like libraries and museums. The program's message was simple: kindness and respect should be the foundation of every public establishment. Princess Charlotte took an active role in its growth. Despite being young, she insisted on being involved in meetings with advisors and charity representatives. She wanted to understand the struggles that different communities faced and listen to the experiences of families who often felt excluded from places due to their social or financial circumstances. Her natural curiosity and empathy made her a compelling advocate for change. One of her visits under the initiative was to a small cafe in Manchester that had recently received the royal endorsement. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Margaret, had built her cafe with the vision of creating a welcoming space for everyone, regardless of background. She greeted Charlotte warmly and introduced her to a group of local children who had benefited from her cafe's free meal program. "We've always believed that a hot meal and a friendly face can change someone's day," Margaret explained as she handed Charlotte a fresh scone. "And thanks to your initiative, more people are paying attention to that idea." Charlotte was deeply moved. She sat with the children, listening to their stories about how much they enjoyed coming to the cafe, a place where they were treated with warmth and respect, rather than as an inconvenience. When she returned to Buckingham Palace that evening, she excitedly told her grandfather about the visit. "They're making such a difference, Grandpapa," she said. "People are realizing that being kind doesn't cost anything, but it means everything." King Charles smiled knowingly. "That is a lesson many take a lifetime to learn, Charlotte, and you are helping to teach it at such a young age." The press continued to cover the initiative, but the tone had changed. Instead of simply reporting on the scandal of the restaurant that had turned Charlotte away, the media now focused on the impact she was making. Headlines spoke of her leadership, her commitment to fairness, and the way she was modernizing the royal family's influence in everyday life. Soon, international interest in the Open Arms initiative grew. Restaurants in France, Italy, and even the United States began reaching out, wanting to adopt similar programs in their countries. It was proof that hospitality was not just a British value, it was a universal one. Charlotte, of course, remained humble about the success. For her, the most important thing was seeing the smiles on people's faces when they walked into a place that made them feel valued. And in the end, that was what truly mattered. As the Open Arms initiative continued to gain traction, it became clear that Princess Charlotte's efforts were making a lasting impact. Restaurants and businesses that once prioritized exclusivity began rethinking their approach, recognizing that true prestige came from their reputation for kindness, not just their clientele. Beyond hospitality, other industries took note. Boutique hotels began offering special community nights where local families could experience luxury accommodations at discounted rates. Museums and galleries introduced free entry days to ensure that art and culture were accessible to all. Even airlines reached out, exploring ways to improve their customer experience by emphasizing inclusivity and warmth. 1 year after the initiative launched, a grand celebration was held at Buckingham Palace to honor establishments that had embraced the movement. Charlotte, now more confident in her role, gave a short speech. This initiative was born from a simple belief that everyone deserves to feel welcome. "I hope we continue to build a world where kindness is the greatest luxury we can offer." The applause that followed was thunderous, not just for the princess, but for the change she had inspired. And in that moment, it was clear this was just the beginning of a new legacy in hospitality, led by the youngest royal advocate. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on a restaurant kicking out Princess Charlotte? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.